Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is our second session of the Israel Dialogues. I'm Rabbi Zachary Goodman here at Holy Blossom Temple, and just wanted to get started by expressing a little bit of gratitude to our panelists, to our expert guest today, Asher Susser. I want to say thank you to our promotional partners at ARZA Canada, Canadian Zionist Federation, and we are genuinely appreciative for all that you do. Especially, sorry, I forgot the Reform Jewish Community of Canada. So thank you so much to our promotional partners, as well as everyone who is here watching either live or watching the recording. We know that there's a lot going on in the world these days, and it's meaningful that you're taking this time to engage in these conversations. I'm going to stop talking now and bring on to screen Professor David Dewitt, who can offer us a little more framing for what we are doing bigadol for this entire series, but more importantly, for the conversation today. So welcome, David, to the screen. I believe.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Goodman, and welcome to everyone who's watching this event, whether it's live right now or soon, we hope, through the recording. It's really a pleasure again to join you for the second session of the Israel Dialogues. As I mentioned last week when we began, this really emerged out of an ongoing conversation among 6 colleagues from various backgrounds, all of whom have had some extensive engagement with Israel and with the Middle East in various kinds of professional capacities. And the first 8 sessions in the fall/winter will focus on Israel, Palestine, the domestic issues, the Jewish world, the diaspora, and its relations with Israel. And then our plan is for the winter/spring to have another 8 sessions, which really will focus on the international and regional context of Israel today. And since all of us, I think, are very much concerned about the security and survival of the state of Israel, and at the same time peace within the region, this will provide us an opportunity to bring in many of the international actors and the international factors and regional factors that drive the situation. Today, we're going to examine something that has been ongoing for too long, and that is the issue of a 2-state solution. And we're fortunate to have leading off John Allen. John has held many appointments and senior positions in the Canadian government, in the diplomatic community, and perhaps most relevant for many of us in the context of the discussion today, he was from 2006 to 2010 Canada's ambassador to Israel. Since that time, he's continued an active involvement in terms of his individual capacity as a citizen. And among other things, he currently is the president of Project Rosanna, which is a not-for-profit whose objective is to build bridges between Palestinians and Israelis via the health sector. Joining John, we're thrilled that Asher Susser from Israel, and someone who knows Toronto, he's a regular visitor to Toronto, and our good fortune, he happens to be in Toronto right now, visiting family. Asher Susser is one of Israel's leading scholars and experts on the contemporary Middle East, the contemporary Arab world, and in particular Palestine, Palestinians, Jordan, and the immediate surrounding communities of Arab states, and of course, Israeli Arabs and the context within Israel. Usher was for quite a number of years, if I recall, at least 2 or 3 terms, 12 years or so, director of the international renowned Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies at Tel Aviv University, and is a recently retired professor of history of the Middle East from Tel Aviv University. He's the author of many books and articles, policy papers. And while this is not in his CV, I should say that when I had the good fortune of getting to know Usher when I was at the Dayan Center, we stayed in touch, and I heard that he was importantly invited to join then the late Prime Minister Rabin on his very important trip to Amman, where the background and the framing of the Israel-Jordan peace treaty occurred. And Usher was invited as one of Israel's leading experts on this topic. That's not in his CV, but it gives you a sense that this is a scholar not only of scholarship, but a scholar of the practice of implementing scholarship to affect policy. So it's a great pleasure. And with that, let me turn it over to John Allen. We'll begin the session.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm particularly happy that Asher Susser is joining us for this conversation. I've known him since my time in Israel. I benefited then greatly from his knowledge and from his experience. And I'm looking forward to engaging with him today and with you on this this topic, which remains, I agree, David, it's been around for a long time, but it remains key to, from my perspective, as you will hear, key to the future of a liberal Zionist Israel. For those of you looking for a battle between Asher and I on this question, unfortunately, you're not going to get one because we are both two-staters. And I'm going to try and sort of set the stage, give you a little bit of the history, which many of you are undoubtedly familiar with, and give some general recommendations. Asher, who has studied this issue for a long time, will give you more specific recommendations on the way forward and offer years of experience on this issue. So let me begin. The issue of the establishment of a Palestinian state is not new. Indeed, it's been the subject of various rounds of negotiations from Camp David in '78 to Madrid and Oslo in the 1990s and to the Y Plantation Accords in 1998. And then, of course, the most recent failed efforts by John Kerry and the Obama administration. Even Donald Trump, who probably did more than any other US president to inflame the situation on the ground, had a so-called peace plan. Unfortunately, his plan favored Israel on every key issue that eventually will have to be agreed by the two sides. And happily, that plan is now off the table. To be clear, and contrary to what politicians and ambassadors from Arab states have told me over the years, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the cause of the region's multiple other crises and conflicts. For example, those in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, or Libya. Nor is it the reason that Iran is a potential nuclear threat and a supporter of terrorism. What the conflict has become, however, is an occupation that has now lasted 54 years and that has denied Palestinians the most basic rights of citizenship, freedom of movement, equality under the law, and of course, self-determination. Israel, which was once seen as the David in an ongoing battle with the Arab states and an island of liberal democracy, has become the Goliath in an asymmetrical conflict with the Palestinian people. Its last government under Bibi Netanyahu was the most illiberal and polarizing of any in the country's 73-year history. And in my view, for both Israelis and Palestinians, Palestinian statehood, the two-state solution, is an existential issue that must be resolved. And while reaching that goal won't be easy and it will take time, it's the only viable option for these two peoples. Why has it been so hard to find a solution to this problem? Obviously, the reasons are many and they're complicated. Here are a few. First of all, the Palestinians and the Israelis have very different narratives about what happened in 1947 and since. I'll come back to that when talking about some possible solutions. Second, as noted, the political, economic, and power relationships between the two are fundamentally asymmetrical. One feels no compelling need to compromise, and the other is in no position to demand a hearing. Third, the world has, for the most part, left the issue to the United States to help resolve up until now. And frankly, US governments have only been semi-honest brokers in their efforts to bring the parties together. Donald Trump was, of course, part of the problem rather than the solution. Finally, the situation on the ground is not conducive to peace. Israel had a leader up until a few months ago who was opposed to the two-state solution and who supported the expansion of settlements in the occupied territories that all Western countries consider illegal under international law. The current PM also refuses to support a two-state solution or end the occupation. At the time of Camp David, there were 500 settlers in the West Bank and Gaza. During the Oslo negotiations, there were about 100,000. When I served in Israel, there were approximately 250,000. Today, there are over 600,000 settlers in both the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Does anyone believe that this is not an effort to fundamentally change the facts on the ground and to eliminate the possibility of a viable Palestinian state? The political dynamics in the Palestinian territories are also far from conducive to peace. The numerous efforts to unify Hamas and Fatah have failed. Hamas is no more interested in the two-state solution than Bibi Netanyahu was. It refuses to affirm Israel's right to exist. The latest conflict attests to this failure. The Palestinian Authority and its 85-year-old leader, Mahmoud Abbas, who recently canceled the first election to be held in the territories in 14 years, have little credibility. A recent poll, for example, suggests that only 19% of Palestinians support Abbas's continuing leadership. From the Palestinians' perspective, Israel was the last colonial state and was dropped into the region to assuage European guilt for the Holocaust. Millions of Palestinians are now refugees in various Arab countries and worldwide as a result, in their view. In the region, the Palestinians are living as virtual prisoners in Gaza or are governed by military rule in the West Bank. The perspectives of the average Israeli is quite different. For the majority of Israelis, the two-state solution remains the best option. Unfortunately, they have little faith that it can be achieved in a way that will ensure their future security. Bibi Netanyahu regularly sowed fear in their hearts and played on their insecurities. The repeated past failures to secure peace, which most Israelis are told and believe were the sole fault of the Palestinians, bear a large part of the blame. And finally, life is simply too good for the average Israeli. The economy is strong, Israeli culture is flourishing, and 4 former enemies just signed the Abraham Accords that recognized Israel without first agreeing to Palestinian statehood or anything else for that matter. Most Israelis prefer to simply ignore the time bomb in Gaza and in the West Bank rather than look 20 years ahead into a possible abyss. From a security perspective, Israel is in a particularly strong position today. It has the 7th largest and best equipped militaries in the world and the nuclear option. Syria and Lebanon/Hezbollah are otherwise preoccupied. Saudi Arabia and other Arab Sunni states are more allied with Israel, at least in their opposition to Iran and Hezbollah, than ever before. Yes, Hamas continues to fire rockets into Israel and deny the state's existence. And yes, Hezbollah is building up a massive rocket capacity in Lebanon and was operating alongside the Iranian military guard in Syria. Yes, Iran challenges Israel's existence. But that scenario hasn't changed for years, and Israel has always defended itself. Far more Israelis die in traffic accidents every year than all the deaths caused in recent conflicts with Lebanon and Hamas combined. Despite what Bibi Netanyahu repeated for years, a Palestinian state is not, I repeat, not going to significantly change the security situation for the worse. So where does all this leave us? First, for those who say peace between Israel and the Arabs is not possible, let's remember that Israel signed peace treaties with both Egypt and Jordan, and just signed deals with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Second, any number of ex-heads of the Mossad, the Shin Bet, and the IDF believe and have stated publicly that in the long run, the enemy within the Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem is more of a threat to Israel than an independent Palestinian state separated by a defined border. Third, in my view, the 2-state solution remains the only viable way forward. Why? Because the alternative, the so-called 1-state solution, offers 2 bad choices going forward. Because Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel proper will outnumber the Jewish population by 2030. When that happens, a 1-state solution means either a Palestinian majority state with Palestinians treated as equals under the law. This would be tantamount to the end of Israel as a Jewish state and as the homeland of the Jews, and Israel won't let this happen. Alternatively, a 1-state solution would mean that a Jewish minority would rule the country in true apartheid fashion over an Arab-Israeli majority, i.e. Palestinians would be 3rd-class citizens in their own country. In one case, the Palestinians would continue to be denied their legitimate rights. In both cases, Israel would cease to be the country that the UN created in 1947, and the Jews in Israel and in the diaspora have looked to as a safe haven and a symbol of Western values ever since. Finally, I disagree with those who suggest that the option of a 2-state solution is over. The Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, And I can tell you that no one in the West or in the Soviet Union predicted it or had any sense that it was going to happen then. The troubles in Northern Ireland were largely settled in a negotiation in 1998 that ended some 400 years of conflict between Catholics and Protestants there. Few thought such an outcome was possible. Most in South Africa, including the keenest of observers, believed that apartheid would be around for at least another 50 years. One day it ended. And 60 years after the Holocaust, Berlin is one of the hottest destinations for young Israeli immigrants. So what will it take to solve the conflict? First, each side must listen to and hear the other's narrative. They needn't agree with the other's story, but they must try to understand where the other is coming from and respect their worldview. The Palestinians and the Israelis need strong and pragmatic leaders with vision and who understand that the status quo is in neither of their favors because it doesn't exist. Facts on the ground are changing daily, including the demographics. They will have to have the strength to push back against extremists and cynics on both sides, and they must be willing to take a chance on peace. They must begin with small steps to build trust and demonstrate that there is indeed a horizon for peace. Eventually, both sides will have to make hard compromises on the outstanding final status issues, and that won't be easy for either side. These include compromises on the status of Jerusalem, which will have to be shared, on the right of return of Palestinian refugees, which will have to be limited to about 100,000 max, on boundaries, which will have to be negotiated. Some settlements will have to be dismantled, and about 150,000 settlers will have to be resettled in Israel proper. The major settlement blocks will remain, and Israeli territory will be transferred to the Palestinian state in exchange for those that do remain. Israeli security will have to be safeguarded. None of these issues are impossible to solve. Past negotiations have produced multiple formulas and approaches in respect of all of them, including on security. The Israeli author Amos Oz had his own take on the conflict. He viewed Israelis and Palestinians as actors in a complex theatrical drama. There were two possible outcomes. One concluded like a Shakespearean tragedy, with all concerned dead on the stage. The other had a Chekhovian ending, where everyone was disappointed, disillusioned, and depressed, but all were still standing as the curtain closed. No one believes the solution to this conflict will be easy or will happen tomorrow, but it is possible, and let's hope that Chekhov wins out. So thank you, and let me pass the baton to my friend and colleague, Asher Susser. Asher, the floor is yours.
Oh, good afternoon, and first of all, thank you very much, Rabbi, and David and John for their very kind words and kind introductions. Carrying on from where John left off, we really do not disagree either on the analysis or on the conclusions. But there are a few points that I would like to emphasize, drawing on what John has already said. I want to make 3 points. One on narratives and Palestinianness. What makes Palestinians Palestinian? The second is, why have we failed thus far to achieve some kind of settlement? And the third, what should we do about it? What is it that we can indeed do. So first, Palestinianness. Palestinianness is not an ethnic distinction between Palestinians and other Arabs. The Palestinians, like other Arabs, are for the most part Sunni Muslim speakers of the Arabic language. What makes Palestinians is their collective memory related to the traumatic events for them of 1948. The defeat, the loss of homeland, refugeedom, what they see as the ultimate injustice, the Nakba, the disaster, as they call it. As we, the Israelis, see our state as the ultimate historical justice to the oppressed of the universe of those days, the Palestinians see their situation as the ultimate injustice, the complete opposite to how the Israelis believe in themselves. Making peace as a final settlement with Israel is coming to terms, as the Palestinians would see it, with the perpetrators of their tragedy. It's a tall order. And that leads me to the second point of why is it that we failed? There's a big difference between the conflict between Israel and the Arab states and between Israel and the Palestinians. In the conflict between Israel and the Arab states, Egypt and Syria and Jordan, what we had to resolve was the question of Israel's conquest of 1967. The 1967 file. Returning to Egypt, what we occupied in 1967 was the basis for a historical peace agreement. We achieved the same with Jordan, and we were nearly there with Syria in the 1990s. But with the Palestinians, there are two files. 1967, the West Bank and Gaza, and East Jerusalem. But beyond 1967, and from the Palestinian point of view, even more critical than 1967, is the 1948 file that we don't have with Egypt, Syria, or Jordan. Needless to say, we don't have any 1948 or even 1967 file with the countries that just signed the Abraham Accords with Israel, as John mentioned a few minutes ago. So Israel's strategy in the negotiations with the Palestinians, Oslo, and after that, Camp David under President Clinton, and subsequently Ehud Olmert and Abu Mazen, Israel's strategy was to make major concessions on the 1967 file, withdrawing from 90% and more of the West Bank, conceding on Arab Jerusalem. That is, major concessions from the Israeli point of view in the 1967 file, in exchange for closure of 1948. That is, no refugee return of any great consequence. To this trade-off, the Palestinians refused. For them, it was critical to have at least some redress on 1948, some element of return. But there was never any agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians on the numbers of who would return. And the Palestinians usually refused to give any numbers at all. And the major difference here between the Israelis and the Palestinians was on the issue of choice. From the point of view of the Palestinian leadership, the right of return meant free choice for the Palestinians who would return. From the Israeli point of view, it couldn't be freedom of choice. From the Israeli point of view, it was the Israeli government's sovereign right to decide who and how many would return to Israel. So on this issue of choice, in reference to the right of return, the refugee issue became impenetrable and insoluble. There was, very famously, the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which was re-endorsed in 2007 by the Arab League. And the Arab Peace Initiative spoke about an agreed solution for the refugee problem that seemed to be going a long way towards Israel, an agreed solution to the refugee question. But the very same resolutions of the Arab League rejected the idea of any refugee resettlement. That made this refugee issue insoluble from the Israeli point of view. If there is no refugee resettlement, then where are the refugees in Jordan and Lebanon supposed to end up, if not in Israel? Both sides agreed to two states. But the perceptions of two states on both sides is intrusive into the state of the other side. The Palestinian perception is two states, the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, with refugee return to Israel. So the two-state idea penetrates into Israel from the Palestinian state on the refugee question, whereas the Israeli perception of two states penetrates, intrudes into Palestine on security issues. Israelis demanding military presence and demilitarizations and security arrangements that would be made in the Palestinian state. So we failed. And the question is now, what do we do about this? What can we do? What should we do? The Zionist enterprise had two grand historical objectives. One was to create the nation state of the Jewish people, and the other was to become a legitimate member of the family of nations. If we continue the status quo, if we continue the occupation, we will not remain the nation state of the Jewish people, as John outlined before, how the demographics are working against Israel, if we maintain the occupation. And we will not be a legitimate member of the family of nations, continuing the occupation of the Palestinians after 54 years that we have already done so. So Israel faces an existential dilemma. We seek to maintain the status quo because we don't expect peace to break out anytime soon. But the status quo is untenable, and in the long run would lead to the undoing of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. So what is it that we can do? If a peace agreement with the Palestinians on an Israeli withdrawal and the creation of two states is not in the offing anytime soon, but time is not working in Israel's favor, I would argue that it is in Israel's best interests to promote the creation of a two-state reality by launching an initiative of its own, an independent Israeli unilateral initiative to change the situation on the ground, designed to recreate the two-state dynamic and to arrest the one-state dynamic with all its negative consequences for Israel and the Zionist idea further down the road. And this initiative taken by Israel, if possible, should be coordinated with the Palestinians. There's no reason not to coordinate with them as much as is possible not necessary to seek their agreement and endorsement, but to coordinate. This would mean an eventual and gradual withdrawal of Israel from up to maybe exceeding even 90% of the West Bank over a period of years. Not overnight as this was done in Gaza, but over a period of years, 5, 7, 10 years, Israel would gradually roll back the occupation. Just by initiating the process and beginning to implement it, Israel would already be telling the Palestinians and the world at large, Israel is rolling back the occupation. This would create not a two-state solution, but a two-state reality from which the two states would eventually negotiate the outstanding issues: final borders, Jerusalem, refugees, security arrangements. This is no easy process. It would require Israel unilaterally, without any compensation from the other side, to withdraw anywhere between 100 to 150,000 settlers. This is a very tall order for any government in Israel. But what must be clear to the Israelis? It is not compensation from the other side that we seek in this phase, but the long-term preservation of the basic fundamental idea, the preservation of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. Hanging on to the territory in the name of some kind of security, which may be less problematic, as John outlined before, than people may think. But hanging on to the territory in the name of security undermines Israel's long-term survivability. This is exactly what Ariel Sharon understood in withdrawing from Gaza. He knew, as we all knew, that from the withdrawal from Gaza, peace would not follow. But I would still say that in the name of the preservation of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, with all the troubles that have followed the withdrawal from Gaza, it was a justifiable decision then, and I would argue now that something similar, not exactly the same, should be repeated over a period of time in the West Bank. The one-state reality in which we are, and the one-state dynamic which is in the works, is, as John pointed out, and I fully agree, a recipe for long-term disaster. And in the long run, will lead to the establishment of an Arab majority state in which the Jews will be an ever-declining minority. Not a great future for Israel. And therefore, I end my remarks endorsing what John said before, in favor of the two-state solution, not because it is ideal and not because it is problem-free, but it is a lot better than any alternative that I could possibly think of. Thank you.
I think David is going to come back. Here he is.
And Howard has joined us as well. So before I go forward, with apologies, I should have mentioned to everyone who's watching that should you have questions or comments to contribute, if you would use the Q&A function, and we will try and get to as many of them as we can. And there is a question that came up early on, and it's not surprising, and it's not one of the easier ones, but let's start with that and see where it goes between Asher and John. How do you propose to solve the Jerusalem situation? since you both have obviously common views of the centrality of the two-state, where does Jerusalem fit, and how would you address it?
Asher, why don't you go first, and then I'll jump in.
On Jerusalem, in previous negotiations, there was actually quite a large basis of agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and this comes up in what were called the Clinton parameters in 2000, where it was agreed, and this I think remains the guiding principle, that the division of the city should be according to the demographic realities in different parts. Arab residential areas become part of the state of Palestine, and Jewish residential areas become part of the state of Israel, irrespective of where they may be, east or west. Some of the Jewish residential areas are now on the eastern side. So Jewish residential areas would become part of Israel, and Arab residential areas would become part of the state of Palestine and the capital of Palestine. What remained the core of conflict between the parties and was never agreed was what to do about Temple Mount and its immediate environs, the Holy Basin, as it is called. This is a very small part of Jerusalem, but needless to say, of critical importance. And what was suggested then, and what I would propose today, if it were up to me, would be the internationalization of Temple Mount and its immediate environs, allowing some kind of international supervision of the religious sites and the guarantee of religious freedom for all members of all religions in these places, without assigning specific sovereignty either to the Palestinian side or to the Israeli side. The Israelis were more inclined to accept this internationalization than the Palestinians ever were. It is not an acceptable solution these days as far as the Palestinians are concerned, but that is where I would suggest we go if we were looking for a solution to the Jerusalem issue.
Yeah, I would concur completely. I would just add two things. One, a former Canadian ambassador named Michael Bell, who was ambassador in Egypt, in Israel twice, and in Jordan, and director of the Middle East Division, and a colleague, Mike Malloy, who was the gavel of the Refugee Working Group at the time of the Madrid Conference, and subsequently ambassador in Jordan, worked with a number of Palestinians, Israelis, and Americans to come up with something called the Old City Initiative, in which they outlined in great detail how the Israelis and the Palestinians could share, work together. There would be an East Jerusalem, there would be Jerusalem for the Israelis, but obviously in such tight quarters, you had to work out how you were going to share water and electricity and management, et cetera, et cetera. And there is something there. The other thing I would say is that the idea of the Arab and the Jewish residential issues are now being impacted by the increase in the number of settlements in the area, so that the area between Ramallah and Bethlehem is now being filled or attempted to be filled by settlements, frankly, in an effort to prevent East Jerusalem from being a capital that would be contiguous with the rest of the West Bank. And these are the kinds of facts on the ground that I think we should all be opposed to, so that we can remove as many obstacles to peace going forward.
Howard, I know you thought a lot about this. Do you want to add anything?
Well, I was going to ask a couple of questions. One, not about Jerusalem, but about shrinking the conflict, because that's a theme that's becoming prevalent. And I wonder if both Asher and John would comment on whether their proposals are distinctive from the general pattern of shrinking the conflict? And if so, what are the differences?
Go ahead, Asher.
I think the main difference that I would mention is the point that I have taken, which I think is a lot more far-reaching than Micha Goldman, on the settlement issue. That is the willingness to take initial steps that would significantly alter in this process of shrinking the settlement, shrinking the conflict, if that's the term we wish to use. What I'm proposing, I think, goes further and faster on the settlement issue than others thus far, although my ideas on this coordinated unilateralism are not only mine, and they have been proposed not by Micha Goldman, but by other people and bodies in Israel, primarily, I would say, the INSS, the major body of strategic studies in Israel. So that is where I would point to what I think is the most serious difference. Because I think it's what has to be done and what has to be faced sooner rather than later is changing the facts on the ground in reference to settlements in order to allow for Palestinian contiguity.
Yeah, I would once again. I'm sorry to people who love conflict and are used to watching, the news and having two sides fight. But I couldn't agree more. I'll just make a couple of comments. Improving the economic life of Palestinians, increasing the number of work permits, more access to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. Those are good things. And for many Palestinians, they're important things, but they're not an alternative to moving towards a two-state solution. You can't simply suggest that once their economic life is improved, and it's only going to be improved a certain amount, that they will forget about their desire for a Palestinian state, which is a kind of dangerous road that I think even Bennett is going down, where he says there'll never be a Palestinian state on my watch, but we are going to improve the occupation. I do agree that we need small steps. And I agree with Asher. I don't know whether we can get to unilateral withdrawal and how quickly, but even before then, we need small steps of trust so that the two sides really understand that the other is serious about trying to find a real solution. We need a horizon for peace. And despite what many people have said over the years, the settlements, in my view, are one of the major obstacles, because they signal to Palestinians, you are not serious about peace. You are trying to expand the facts on the grounds and make it impossible for peace to happen. And we know that there are many Israelis, not a majority by any extent, but many Israelis who believe in a greater Israel. And as long as the settlement project continues, you're not going to convince anybody, including the West, that you're serious about moving forward or creating a horizon for peace.
Can I have a follow-up on the issue of returning settlers? I'll later on ask about returning refugees. But Asher, you in your articles have mentioned 100,000 returnees. John, you mentioned 150,000 in your talk. And Asher, in your talk, used 100 to 150,000 returnees. Where do the figures come from? Are they arbitrary? Are they expandable? Why that number?
They have an origin, and the origin is, I think, very interesting and explains a lot. in the negotiations between Olmert and Abu Mazen, it is the Palestinians who came up with this figure, 100 to 150,000. And Olmert's reply was 5,000 refugees, 1,000 a year for 5 years. So there was a huge gap between what the parties were suggesting. And I can't conceive of any government in Israel that would agree to 100 or 150,000. But interestingly, these numbers, 100 to 150,000, were leaked by WikiLeaks. That then got into Al Jazeera and into The Guardian, and caused a furor in Palestinian society, totally rejecting the numbers, totally rejecting any numbers. And the Palestinian argument was there can never be a cap on refugee return. As I mentioned in my comments, it is a right of return that every Palestinian should have. Israel cannot put a cap on it, and nobody can put a cap on it. If 700,000 wish to return, they should be allowed to do so. If only 10,000 wish to return, that will be the end of the story. But the decision is Palestinian. The Israelis, who are responsible for the refugee problem in the first place, so the Palestinians would argue, don't have a right to put a cap on the number. So this number of 100 and 150,000 has a basis. But when it became public knowledge, and this, I would say this is the great weakness of the Palestinian negotiators. In the closed room with the Israelis, they say all sorts of things. But they have had monumental failure in selling these kinds of ideas to their publics. And that is what the WikiLeaks, Guardian, Al Jazeera exposure revealed so strikingly in 2008. Was whatever Abu Mazen and Saib Arikat said in the closed rooms with the Israelis was worth nothing in the refugee camps of Balata and Askar in Nablus.
I guess I would just add to that. You say, Asher, that Israel would never accept 100 to 150,000. I find it ironic because in the scenario that we have played out, that I've never heard strong arguments against, they're going to have to accept 2.5 million Palestinians from Gaza. They're going to have to accept the million in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. So this we talk about the right of return as being this apocalypse, when the reality is, if Israel does not move to end the occupation and does not move towards two states, the right of return is going to happen, and they're not going to be able to stop it. And the reason that Palestinians today are turning to the one-state solution as an answer is because they understand that. They say, why should we spend our time arguing about a two-state solution and get 22% of what is Israel, when if we hang in there, the international community, the West, will not tolerate an occupation that goes on forever. And the one state is going to happen one way or another. And even if Israel wants to make it an apartheid state, it's going to eventually turn into an Arab Palestinian majority. So we cry about the right of return and 150,000 people, which will not change the demographics at all. And we forget that we're, as I said before, in the face of an abyss coming forward for Israel.
David,
If I
do
could
I have
just,
a chance for a third question?
Oh, not now, Howard.
Could I just add a word to John?
Of course.
You're absolutely right. And there is an internal contradiction here in the Israeli position. But those who speak about the 150,000 or 100,000 that they do not wish to accept are the two-staters. It's the Tzipi Livnis of the world who say, we accept a Palestinian state, and therefore the refugees should return to Palestine. What Tzipi Livni and Ehud Olmert used to say was that if we accept a Palestinian state, why should the refugees return to Israel? it is the two-staters who are objecting. The one-staters would agree with what you just said, and they have other ideas about what to do about the millions of Palestinians. Some of them, I would say, pretty catastrophic ones. But it's not. They don't bring up the 150,000 problem. It's the moderates, the two-staters who do.
And I'll just respond by saying, why should the Palestinians accept the major settlement blocks? Why should they accept that? Because they have to compromise, because there's a certain reality and they have to make a compromise. And they're going to have to compromise on the Temple Mount, as you said. I mean, it's not going to be only theirs with their controlling who else can. But that's what the nature of compromise is. And I'll just say one other thing. What we need, it just points out what you said about Abu Mazen and Olmert and what we know about Bennett. We need leadership. We need people leading their citizens, telling their citizens the truth about the dangers and about the long-term and the short-term dangers. We don't need people stoking fears and ignoring the reality going forward. And that's not easy, but I think it can happen.
So there are a number of questions on the Q&A. And again, in the audience, if you have a question, please send it to the Q&A, not through the chat. All in some ways, some way or another relate to the practical question of negotiation and the practical question of the context of negotiation. And that could be seen by some questions having to do with confidence and security building measures. What are the confidence and security building measures that could be instituted that could create the trust in the process of negotiation? I recall, and all of you, certainly the four of us will know, that 25 years ago, there was a very active two-track diplomacy channel and 1.5 track, where academics and other experts got together from the various sides and engaged one another, and they were sufficiently senior and recognized in their own home countries that they had direct access to their governments, and they could facilitate conversation even when Israelis were not allowed to be speaking to PLO. There were these track two, and a few of us were involved in those. Those seem not to be present now, and I'm not suggesting that this is the only way, but it may be simply an indicator that there has been a decline in even interest in trying to find ways to create practical steps to slowly build confidence and trust so that negotiations and all these issues that Asher and John, you have mentioned, might go forward and might at least bring the other side to better appreciate the narrative that they're sitting across the table from. So I'm wondering if you have some comments around this notion of confidence building, of trust building, of the practice of being able to sit down and negotiate some of these very tough issues. And certainly, John, this has been your professional life. And Asher, you've been involved in it in the Middle East, specifically in Israel and Jordan, and other areas I know, track 2, track 1.5, and advising the Israeli government. And both Howard and I have done track 2 things. But really, this question is, first of all, to Asher and to John, and then we'll see where it goes.
I'll just say a couple of things. Hamas presents a massive problem here because they don't want to be a part of the game. They see not being a part of the game as their strength. Israeli leaders and Israelis in general can simply point to them as part of this long history of never missing an opportunity, etc. So that is a major problem. Another problem, and I'm just talking about past obstacles, was the Israeli government refused to support Mahmoud Abbas despite his continuing efforts to protect Israel through cooperation on security issues, and they allowed his popularity to drop to the point at where it is. So I'm not saying he is a Democrat. I'm not saying he's not 85 years old, but there are no Democrats in the Arab world right now. And we're not waiting for liberal democracy to come to Palestine. We're waiting for legitimate leaders. He has expressed in the past a willingness to negotiate. He has recognized Israel, and as has the PLA and the PLO. So And what Israel has to do, what it should have been doing and what it has to do is build up trust in the other side so that the average Israeli on the street doesn't think that every Palestinian is about to pull a knife and kill them. That is not the case. And I suggest that if there was a horizon and if there were steps, then you could begin to turn that perception around. Practical steps. I mean, I've spoken about settlements ad nauseum, so I don't have to do that. The fact that the defense minister was prepared to meet with Abbas, sit down and talk to him for the first time. Positive. The fact that Lapid will engage, hopefully, with his counterparts. Opening up a dialogue on a variety of issues that don't necessarily have to touch on the two-state solution, but do improve the lives of Palestinians without suggesting that that is the ultimate alternative. There are many things that can be done in terms, the IDF. I mean, we have just had a couple of weeks of situation where settlers were stoning Palestinians while the IDF sat by, videoed for the world to see, a pogrom on the part of settlers. Stop it. The IDF should be carrying out its, and the police, and have the Israeli judiciary follow up. We know that Palestinians will be prosecuted if there's violence, but we never see evidence of Israelis being prosecuted. These are the kinds of steps that will demonstrate that Israel is intent on protecting the basic civil rights of the Palestinian people.
Asher?
Well, I agree with John, of course, on these issues, and of course, talking to the Palestinian leadership, improving the economy, both in the West Bank and Gaza. That's all, I would say, something that has to be done. But I still think that two things have to come from the Israeli side. We're obviously not there yet, but they have to come from the Israeli side. And that is, John spoke previously about leadership. It's about time for the Israeli leadership to speak to the Israeli people about the long-term future. What awaits us if we don't do this? It's not only about confidence-building measures between us and the Palestinians. It's about the long-term survivability of Israel. We never talk about it. Number one, what the Israeli leadership has to do is to begin to do that, to begin to educate the Israeli people about the consequences of not doing anything. For 54 years, the decision was we decided not to decide. And that is what has brought us to this impasse. Confidence building mainly will come from what would be from the Israelis an indication that we are rolling back the occupation. First, no more settlements. Second, to begin to withdraw some of the most isolated and intrusive. I don't think anything else would be seen by the Palestinians as anything other than sweetening the occupation. We have to give a real indication. It doesn't have to happen tomorrow, but we have to give a real indication that the occupation is being rolled back. It may take 10 years until we get there. And this is about confidence for the Israelis in gradualism and time. That is, we do things gradually with time, testing the waters as we move along. And the Palestinians here have to give their quid pro quo. it would be a really bad idea if we withdrew from Jenin and got rockets on Afula the next day. But we have to begin this process. And that means a recognition by the leadership that we have to change course. And secondly, small, tiny footsteps in that direction at the beginning towards a known end result of ending the occupation. One comment more. Israel has not withdrawn from anywhere in the last 21 years, except by unilateral decisions. So it withdrew from Lebanon, so it withdrew from Gaza. If we would have waited for agreements to withdraw from Lebanon and withdraw from Gaza, we would still be there.
And let me just add that a leader would not be alone. Go to the website of Commanders for Peace.
Oh, yeah.
See
right.
the list of former IDF generals, chiefs of staff, heads of Mossad, heads of the Shin Bet. It is unfortunate in our world, and certainly when you talked about the suggestion, well, it wasn't here, but there is the suggestion you cannot criticize the IDF because you'll be called disloyal. It's time for existing IDF generals to say what ex-IDF generals are saying, that there is an abyss down there. Tzipi Livni was a member of Likud. She's no left-wing Americans for Peace now. She will tell the same story. Olmert will tell the same story. This is not a figment of a liberal peacenik imagination. And breaking the silence is the perfect example of people who fought, who were at the checkpoints, who were honored soldiers in the IDF, who have seen the light and who don't want to see Israel go down that road.
Well, let me then, John, pick up on that and ask Asher specifically, and then Howard may have an additional insight to this. There have been a series of questions that pick up on where John's last comment, is leading, and where your comment, Asher, about creating confidence within Israel and having leadership. And the question is about Israeli domestic politics. How it's shaping, where are the points of opportunity? Some of the questions ask it in terms of, is there a difference between religious communities in Israel, Jewish communities, and towards Orthodoxy? Now there's a Reform community, there's a conservative community. A lot of Israelis have defined themselves as secular. How important is that in terms of moving the politics in the directions that you and John have been speaking of? What about other factors in which the domestic political scene can shift? It's perhaps too romantic to think about it shifting back to what it once was in the first 20 years, where there was this notion of labor's Zionism. And there are some who would believe that might have led things differently if it continued. Obviously, that's a separate issue. But I think there is this issue of where are the opportunities within the Israeli political scene. If we look back at the last 30 years and how it has shifted, right perhaps is not the right designation, but it has shifted, in some hard ways. And as John said in his opening comment, Israelis find life very good. So what's going to have them reconsider their options?
I'll give you the example of Ariel Sharon. Why did Sharon change his mind? Sharon was struck when he became prime minister by information that he got from demographers in academia. Sharon is the archetype of the kind of leadership we need. Number one, a leader that has a lot of public confidence, and from the right. I think it would require for Israel to do anything remotely similar to what we're talking about is a leadership that would come from within the ranks of the right. Now, this is not totally imaginary. It has happened a few times before. We've just mentioned Olmert and Tzipi Livni, and before them, Ariel Sharon. I don't see anybody that I could put my finger on now coming from the right who would fit the bill here. But I think that is what we would require. I think the public would be ready to follow a leader who would have a very clear conviction and present it to the public as the majority followed Sharon on Gaza. But Netanyahu was the opposite. Bennett is not the person. But I couldn't say that I know who the guy is, but that is what it would have to be. Somebody from the ranks of the political right who would be able to tell the people, we have to cut our suit according to the amount of cloth we have. And that is what Sharon explained, and people understood. The weakness within Israeli society derives very much, I would say, from the trauma of the bus bombings of the early 2000s. The peace camp in Israel, the so-called peace camp, was decimated by that and has yet to recover. Israelis remember that very clearly. It is a nightmare. And if there is a chance of that returning, Israelis will be very skeptical about all of this. And it will be very difficult to convince them. The Palestinians also have their side to contribute here. But again, I say, waiting for the Palestinians to make their contribution may force the Israelis to wait for too long. It's we who must seize the initiative and take the chance.
Let me just add one thing briefly, just to say, Kahol Lavan, blue and white, imploded for all the reasons that we know, the brilliance of Bibi, the strategist, and the naivete of Benny Gantz. But if blue and white, with Gantz, with Lapid, who was the third? I'm forgetting it right now. The three.
Ofer Shelach.
Well, but also there was two former chiefs of staff, and Lapid, who
Ya'alon.
Yeah, Ya'alon. So you had two former chiefs of staff whose credibility, you know, they might not have been considered to be right-wing or Ariel Sharon types. But let's say that party had won a majority or had governed. You could see a situation with those people over time beginning to move towards the kind of scenario that Asher has outlined, realizing that there were dangers, but having the strength and the credibility to move the country in a different direction, begin to move it in a different direction. And I think there are, you know, leaders pop up. There's no dearth of leadership in Israel. And the fact that we've got Meretz and Labor back in a government is a positive thing. So again, you know, I remain half glass full.
So we're tight on our time. I want to turn to Howard. Do you have either a comment on this or another?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more pessimistic and yet optimistic in another way. Asher, you mentioned that the big discrepancy between the leaders of the Arab world or the Palestinian world agreeing to limited exercise and right of return in practice, but the emphasis of giving up on individual choice, not willing to do that. So you get discrepancy between negotiators and the Palestinian population. That is, I think, among Israelis, a real scary possibility. Not only the security issue, but the refugee return issue. Now, one area which I think was progressive in the negotiations was about the distinction between the right of return in principle and the right of return in practice. I think that was progressive. Further, a guy like Rashid Khalidi has proposed right of return to the Palestinian homeland, not to homes. So there is a basis for there and openings there that I don't think have been exploited adequately. I'd like your comments on that.
Plus serious compensation, not by Israel, but by the rest of the world. And not necessarily for Palestinians living in Chile or in Brazil, but for Palestinians in the immediate area.
Yeah, just a comment here on Rashid Khalidi. Returning to the Palestinian homeland and not specifically to the homes from which they originally came, Khalidi here flies in the face of what is the Palestinian consensus in Palestine. If you read what both Fatah and Hamas would say in their resolutions, they speak specifically about the homes from which they left. The problem is for the refugees who are in Gaza and in the West Bank, there are millions of them. You cannot tell them tomorrow, guys, you've actually returned. From tomorrow, you have returned because you're in the homeland. You can't tell them that. You could say something of that nature to the Palestinians in Jordan or in Lebanon, who actually, I don't think are waiting, championing the bid to return. In Lebanon, there are even studies showing that the Palestinians in Lebanon, the refugees, don't want to return to Palestine that they don't know. They want rights in Lebanon. I don't know what they would say today about Lebanon being where it is now, but I'm talking about studies that were taken a few years ago. So, I mean, this is an issue that I think it's going to be extremely difficult to square the circle. And there are things that in the Israeli position are, I admit, quite illogical. If you're willing to concede East Jerusalem, that's 350,000 Palestinians who will become part of Palestine. In exchange, you're only going to take in 100,000. You're actually ending up on the plus side demographically. But people will not accept it because the question with the Israelis is, you start with 100,000, where do you end up? Accepting the right and not the implementation, again, is, okay, we know where we're starting, but we have no idea where this is all going to end up. And this is where the Israelis are very reluctant.
But if there was a Palestinian state, if that was truly on offer, one can conceive of the fact that many Palestinians, I would hope, I would think, would say, okay, we have given something up, but we have our state. It is contiguous. We have finally, left the desert and moved into Jerusalem. That is major. And I don't think they've ever seen it. I accept that the refugee problem was one of the obstacles to getting there. But I also think that at a certain point in time, with leadership, and you don't have to convince, as I said, the diaspora Palestinians. Yeah. Really, I mean, let them say this is unacceptable. But frankly, they live in Santiago or they live in Rio de Janeiro. It's really the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem that we've got to worry about. And if they had their own state, I'm not sure that the right of return would be. I'm not sure. An enduring obstacle.
I think that you could very well be right, but I would argue that we should acquiesce in the creation of a Palestinian state, even if it does not lead to end of conflict, which is what we were demanding at one time. some things may have to be left open. The question is, do we establish something better than what we've got? And to that, we have to aspire. And a two-state reality, that's why I say a two-state reality. I'm not sure we're going to resolve all the problems. In some way, we may be left outstanding for some time to come. But it will be a livable situation for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and for Israelis. Even if it doesn't resolve all the issues, not all our issues and not all their issues. Just don't ask of the other side to undress from their narrative in public. Don't expect them to stand on the roofs of Jerusalem and declare that they're giving up the right of return. Just the same as if we were to withdraw one day from Hebron. Don't expect the Israeli Prime Minister to declare after the withdrawal that we hereby declare that we have no historical rights in Hebron. That kind of finality, I think we were wrong in the first place to have ever sought it, because it leads to the exposure of questions for which we have no solution. So cut your losses by establishing objectives that are less ambitious.
Your permission, I think this is a good place to come to an end for this session. It was a powerful closing statement and gives a lot of thought. It gives us a great deal to think about. So on behalf of the organizing group, I want to thank Asher very much for giving us your time and your expertise. And I hope we'll have you back again very soon. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you for preparing your opening remarks and for coordinating this as well. And Howard, from the West Coast, it's always good to have you on screen. And though you're a long way away, both in distance, in kilometers and time zones, I hope you'll still be an active part of this. So thank you, everyone. Thank you all in the audience. Rabbi Goodman for having Holy Blossom serve as the institutional home for this, and for your technical skills in making us successful in working this through. Finally, my apologies for those who asked interesting questions. We didn't necessarily get to all of them, but I urge you to ask them in other forms again, because this topic spills over into everything else we'll be speaking about. Next week, our focus will be on Gaza and the West Bank. And obviously, some of the issues that we raised today are issues of concern for our conversation next week. Thank you all very much. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Shalom.
Thank you,
Shabbat
David.
Shalom. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you
for
to
organizing.
you, David, as well, for being our organizer. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank
Shabbat
you.
Shalom.
You.